Hi and welcome to our mini lecture series on controlling as a management function. So where are we up to? We've done the introducing management where we talked about the contemporary workplace and the history of management. We've then talked about the functions of management planning and organising, and today we're going to move on to our controlling function. So let's work through that. What I want out of this mini lecture is I want you to be able to describe what control is and why it's important. And then I want you to be able to outline the control process. So organisational control refers to all processes that keep a manager up to date with what's happening in key areas. All right, so it facilitates necessary organisational changes that are needing to be made, but the idea is that you're constantly kept up to date with what's happening. Because controlling as a management function is the process of measuring performance and taking actions to ensure the planned outcomes are achieved. Now, if I don't know what's happening, then I can't measure it and I can't take action. So organisational control is all about keeping up to date, measurement and taking action. Control, broadly speaking, provides a measure of what's happening. It allows us to say, okay, let's take a pulse of what is happening today. Or let's have a look at this financial record or this financial record or this feedback over here or this customer complaint. And this tells me how we're going at any point in time in the company life cycle. It allows us to then verify or check those measurements against a defined objectives. And this is where we start to say, are we on track? Are we not on track? Are we trying to get to our target? Back in the planning, we spoke about identify where we want to be and having steps to be there. Control is all about measuring those steps to make sure we are on track to where we want to be. So appropriate controls can really help identify specific performance gaps and areas for improvements. So it is the next step in the control process. Well, the control process. So why is it important? It's the final link in the management functions. At the end of the day, the only way a manager knows if organisational controls or goals are being met is to control and measure that, right? So we can empower other people and delegate responsibilities if we know whether we're on track or not. If we're not on track, then we're less likely to want to be able to delegate. And it allows us to protect the organisation and its assets by knowing exactly where things are at any one point in time and also planning for how we're going to get to the next place as well. So there are 4 steps in the control process. There's to establish an objective and standard. So what do you want to get? Or where do you want to be? Measure the actual performance, compare it with the objectives and standards that you want to meet, and then take corrective action if needed. So this is known as a cybernetic control system, right? So it's about performance management and correction capability that is self-managed, right? So let's work through that in more detail. This is a diagram of the same thing. So step 1 is to establish performance objectives and standards, right? We need to work out what are we measuring and where are we wanting to be at. Then we want to measure the actual performance that's happening and compare the actual with what our desired is. And if we need to, we take action. So how do we establish objectives and standards? Well, any performance objectives that we have should represent the key results to be achieved. So it could be KPI standard that is listed by the government or that is listed by our board of governors as well. We could be talking about an output standard, which measures performance results in terms of what we actually produce. So quality, quantity, cost on time, percentage error, medication error, all that other jazz. Or we could talk about it in terms of input standards. So what work efforts that go in place to get those inputs happening. So it could be conformance to rules and procedures such as safety within an organisation. Once we know what we want to measure, we then have to measure it, right? So the goal is to actually measure what's happening now, not to get a biased opinion. So in order not to get a biased opinion, we need to have a combination of approaches. So we can use qualitative and quantitative approaches. Quantitative approaches are those that count numbers, and qualitative approaches is that where we're getting feedback through our interviews or other sources such as documents, right? We can have a number of input sources in order to get this reliable number. So we call this triangulation. So if I get the same value from 3 different points, then I know I'm getting and measuring the right thing. Okay? So we really need to start thinking through what measurements are we actually using to measure the actual performance. And we talk about that in the next mini lecture. Once we've got the measurement, we then need to compare it. Right? So we need to understand what our acceptable range of variation is. Now, in life, we're not going to get dollar for dollar value or number by number matching. So what's our acceptance variance? So is it that if we get, say, 5 safety breaches this month, but our goal is 0, is that acceptable or is it not acceptable? If our goal is 0 and we get 1, is that more of an acceptable number? What is our threshold, so to speak? So we need to be really clear about our comparison point. Usually, to do this, we can use, we have comparison points in different ways. So we can have a historical comparison, which says that past performance on the same day using the same methodology has given us this number. We're at this number. Are we better or worse than we were at that point in time? We can do a relative comparison. So we can use benchmarking or other performance achievements to measure up against where we are. We can use an engineering comparison, which uses standards that are set scientifically. And again, we'll talk about this in a future mini lecture. But there's different types of ways in which we do that comparison. And that's really important to get the one that you want. And each of them have their advantages and disadvantages, of course. And the final step in the process is to take corrective action. Now, you can measure something, and you could be in 2 different situations. You could be in a problem situation, or you can be in an opportunity situation. So the problem situation is where the actual performance we're measuring is below what we want, and then we need to do something about it. The opportunity situation is where our performance is above standard. Now, we know that in every situation, while it's good to outperform what you expect, it also creates a waste of resources. So you really, again, need to look at that threshold and make sure that you're okay with that situation itself. All right? So in this process, both exceptions, either a problem or an opportunity, may actually result in action in this case. So management control as a function of management is the process of monitoring, comparing, and correcting work. There are 4 steps in the process. So there's establish objectives and standards, measure it, compare against your current standard, and then take managerial action as appropriate. And both of which are really important in the control process and something that you will need to know. So I look forward to seeing you in the next mini lecture.